Hi everyone, I'm Trish Connor-Cato. Welcome to the Excel 2019 Visual Basic for Applications video course. This course is for beginning users looking to automate repetitive and recurring tasks in Microsoft Excel. VBA is Microsoft's programming language, and it's built into the Office applications. Our focus during this course is on Excel specifically. You'll be equipped with the basics to start writing your own VBA code, modify the code behind macros you've already recorded, and have an understanding of how VBA lends itself to creating efficiency in your daily tasks. We move into creating a form and programming its controls. During this lesson, you will learn about form properties, events, and methods, and learn how to add controls to the form and modify their properties. You'll ultimately launch a form with code. The next lesson will take you through the steps necessary to create pivot tables programmatically in Visual Basic for Applications. If you're enjoying these videos, please like and subscribe. If you want to earn certificates and digital badges, please become a member of our Patreon. The link is in our video description. If you have any questions you want answered by one of our instructors, please join our off-site community. The link is in the description as well. As always, if this course has exercise files, you'll find them in the video description below. Now we're going to get started with Lesson 6, Working with Forms and Controls. We have several topics to cover in this lesson. You're going to start learning about the UserForm object and then its properties, events, and methods. There's a toolbox we'll be using to add controls to the UserForm. We'll go over what kind of controls we'll be able to access from the toolbox. We'll be adding controls to the form and modifying the control properties, formatting the controls, and then we're going to apply code to the controls to determine what their use is going to be. Finally, you'll learn how to launch the form via code. We're going to be using our sales fiscal year file as well as accessing another text file named coding controls during this lesson. So far in this course, you've created message boxes and input boxes. You've learned that message boxes display messages and accepts input from the user via buttons. In our case, it was OK and cancel buttons. An action is then taken on that input via coding. Input boxes display messages to the user, but also allow the user to type in one input or have it default. Just like a message box, input action is taken on the input box via coding. The UserForm objects allow for multiple inputs, which can then be coded to perform specific actions. These inputs can be text, checkboxes, or drop-down lists, for example, and they're known as controls. UserForms have properties, events, and methods that can be accessed. These next few slides are for your reference after you've completed the course. I will be guiding you through this as we do exercise. So I have a slide with a description of form properties that can be accessed. The next one are form events. So, for example, the click event and whatever action is attached to it will occur when the left mouse button is clicked when over the form. And the next slide is about form methods. You have cut, copy, paste, hide, move, so on and so forth. And again, I will be walking you through these during the exercises in this lesson. The one that I do want to cover with you now are form control prefixes. We've used lowercase mod as a prefix for a module. And so if you're looking at them in a list, you'll see them all begin with MOD. We have prefixes for form controls, and I'll guide you through these as we use them. But for example, CHK would be a checkbox. CBO is a combo box. And we'll be utilizing these throughout the lesson. Each form control has its own set of properties, and they differ depending on the type of control. But this slide has a list of common control properties that most controls have. So you have like a height property, a width property, that type of thing. And again, this slide deck is in the video description, so you'll have access to these reference slides. We're ready to get hands-on now with the UserForm object. Before we insert a UserForm object into our sales fiscal year Excel file, let's talk about the different types of modules again. We did a brief review early in the course. Your standard code is stored in modules. Like in this project, we have module 1. We could have renamed it, we didn't. We've also, in a different file, created event procedures. And if you expand your Microsoft Excel objects folder in the Project Explorer window, you'll see one for each sheet. And all the way at the bottom of all of the sheets, you have one called this workbook. And in our vehicles macro-enabled file, we did an event procedure based off of the new vehicles sheet tab, which was known as sheet 3 in the system. Your sheet modules and this workbook module are where you store event procedure codes. And I'm going to just go back up and collapse the Excel objects folder so I don't have to look at all of those sheets. So we have our regular module where you store your function procedures, your sub procedures, and then you have your event procedure modules, your worksheets, and this workbook. Now we also talked about early in the course a class module. The modules we've been using, like module 1, that's a standard module. Class modules we're not going to use in this course. However, those are used to create your own objects. And so now we're going to create a user form, and that actually sets up a forms folder. And no matter how many forms you create in this particular file, they will all go into that forms folder. So it's almost like another module just for user form objects. And you'll see that now as we go to insert our user form. So we're going to just go up to the insert menu and choose user form. And now a couple of things happened. You have the blank grid, a framework for your user form object on your screen. And attached to it is a toolbox which you'll use to access the controls that you're going to put on the form. Now, I'll give you a heads up here. Sometimes if you have double monitors, your toolbox may show up on another monitor, and it could be behind some other open windows. So if you need it, you may have to search it out. If I click on a blank area here, or try to deselect this user form, it'll disappear, but then it'll reappear when I click back on the user form typically. And we can always get it back by using the view menu. Now I'm going to close my toolbox for a minute. It has an X in its upper right hand corner so that I can see in the Project Explorer window that I now have a forms folder with one form in it, which it names by default user form 1. Now we're going to use the properties window to change some of the properties for our user form object. And again, if your properties window is not showing on your left-hand pane, you can go to your view menu and select it, or you can press F4 to bring it up. We are going to give the form a name using the appropriate prefix. We're going to give it a caption, which will show in the title bar of the form. And we're going to give it a height and width measurement. So in the properties window, we're going to start with the name property. We're going to double click name in parentheses, and we're going to type lowercase frm, capital G, generate, capital R, reports. So that's the system name of the form, frm, generate reports. The next property we're going to do is the caption property, and again that shows in the title bar, and we're going to type just in plain English, and as you're typing it you can look at the title bar and see it populating, generate sales reports. And I'm pressing enter after I change a property. We're going to double click height, and we're going to make it 300, and we're going to scroll down if necessary, double click width, and we're going to change that value to 400. And by the way, the height and width values would change if we manually resize the form by dragging its sizing handles. In the next exercises, we're going to add controls to the form and set properties for those controls. So the first thing we need to do is display our toolbox again, and we can get that from the View menu because we closed it by using its X. So we're going to just go to View, Toolbox, and the toolbox shows up again, and we can move it so you can see it clearly. And if you look at the controls in the toolbox, as you hover over them, so the first one is your mouse pointer. It's the Select Objects control. The next one is a label. Third one is a text box. You have a combo box, list box, so on and so forth. So we'll be using several of those controls, placing them on our form, and you'll learn also how to size and align your controls a little bit later in these exercises. So let's get started. We're going to add start date and end date label controls to the form. So in my toolbox, I'm going to look for the label control. It's the capital letter A, and I'm going to click on it on the toolbox. And now if I move my mouse over the form grid, it looks like a crosshair. I can click and hold and draw the label control, or I'm going to just click in the lower left corner of the form and it places the label control there for me. And so now with that label control selected, we're going to change some of its properties. So typically, you don't name labels unless there's going to be some kind of code attached to them. So we're not going to use the name property. We want to look at the auto size property. So the auto size property is set to false. If we double click auto size, it will change it to true, and we want it to be true. And then the caption property is the text that shows on the label. So I'm going to double click caption, and I'm going to type end date in plain English followed by a colon and press enter. And now you see the end date text populating the label. And then you notice how it wrapped end date within that label control. We don't want it to do word wrap. So the last property is word wrap and it's set to true. We're going to double click it to set it to false, so it doesn't wrap the words in the label. And I'm going to just manually move. So I want my mouse pointer to look like a four-headed arrow on that end date label. And I'm going to just drag it down just a little bit. We also want a start date label. So instead of starting from scratch, I'm going to just right click on the end date label and I'm going to choose copy. And then I'm going to right click in a blank area of my form grid and choose paste. So now I'm going to move the copy of the end date label above the existing end date label. And now it's just a matter of changing some of its properties. Couple of things. We didn't give the label a name, so we don't have a label name here. Our other property, auto size, is set to true already because we copied it, and word wrap is set to false. And it's the caption property we're going to change. So I'm going to double click caption and I want it to say start date in plain English with the colon and press enter. So copying it actually saves you time because it copies some of the pertinent property information as well. Now we're going to add two text box controls. We'll do the first one and then copy it and modify the properties for the second one. We're going to find in the toolbox our text box control, and it's the one that has the lowercase ab to the right of your label. Going to select it, and again, when my mouse is on top of the form grid, it looks like a crosshair. And I'm going to click to the right of the end date label and let it place the text box there. I'm going to move mine up just a little bit so it's more in line like that. And with that text box control selected, we are going to give it a name. So in the properties window, we're going to double click name. we're going to use lowercase txt as the prefix for a text box. And we're going to type capital E and capital D date. So txt end date. And the other property that we're going to change for the text box is its width property. And we're going to make the width 50. And then we're going to copy that text box, paste it on the grid, and move it down so it's to the right of the start date label. And on the copy, we're going to just change the name of it to txt start date. And notice the name property didn't come over with the copy because you can't have the same name for controls on a form object. So txt capital S start, capital D date is what we're naming that text box. When this form is completed and totally coded, it will generate sales reports based on user choices in the form. And as such, we want to add two buttons to the form. We want to add a display button and a cancel button. So we're going to use the command button control. In your toolbox, the command button control is in the second row. It's the second one on my screen in the second row, and it looks like a lowercase ab as well. When you hover over it, of course, the screen tip will let you know it is command button. So we're going to go ahead and select it in the toolbox, and we're going to place a command button like in the upper right hand corner of the form. In the properties pane, we're going to name it using CMD as the prefix for a command button, capital D display. So CMD display is the name. And the caption, we're going to go down to the caption property, and that's the text that shows on the button, and it's just going to be display in plain English. And the last property we're going to change is the default property. Default property is currently set to false. We're going to double click it to make it true. So the default property when it comes to a command button is you can press enter to make that button happen instead of having to click on it. That's what the default property does. And you can only have one default property on a button on your object, your UserForm object. So we have CMD display, and we gave it a caption of display, and we changed the default property to true. Now we're going to copy that display button, paste it on the grid, and drag the pasted version underneath your original display button. And again, don't worry about alignment. We'll fix that later. So on the copy, notice the name didn't carry over, right? We're going to name this one CMD, capital C, cancel. We're going to change the cancel property here from false to true. And that means you can use the escape key on your keyboard to make that button happen. And so we set cancel to true. The caption property, we're going to change it to cancel. And the default property, we need to change to false because you can only have one default command button, and that is the display button. If you click on a blank area of your grid, you'll see the display button has like that dark border around it. Whenever you see a button like that in a dialog box, it means you can press your enter key to make that button happen. This would be a good time for us to go ahead and save right from the toolbar before we continue adding controls to this form. Now we're going to add a combo box control to our form. So find the combo box control in your toolbox and select it. And we're going to put it in the lower right hand corner of the form. In the properties pane, we're going to change its name to prefix of CBO and then capital M month. We're going to use its list rows property, and that just says how many rows will be in the drop down list. So we're going to change list rows to 12. And then the match required property, we're going to double click that to change it from false to true. In Visual Basic controls, a combo box by default says no matches required, which means that the end user can type in their own entries and use them from the list. We don't want that to happen. We want them to pull just from the list that we're going to populate later. So we have our combo box in the lower right-hand corner. And now we're going to click in a blank area of the grid. And you can copy your start date or end date label because we're going to want another label. And we're going to paste it onto the grid. And then we're going to move that label to the left of the combo box. I'm going to just move mine down a little bit. And again, we'll do some alignment stuff in a little while. So now we just have to change the label properties. Now we're going to use this label later and code some stuff for it. So we want to give it a name. So we're going to name this LBL, prefix for a label, month, capital M month. And we're going to give it a caption of for which month, question mark. And then I need to move my label over because it auto expanded so it's not overhanging my combo box. So your form should look similar to mine at this point. Now we're going to add 2 frame controls to the form. And we'll add the first one, of course, copy it to create the second one. But the frame control is utilized to group related other controls together. So we're going to start by adding our first frame control. On my toolbox, the frame control is the first one in the second row. It has an XY at the top of it. We're going to click that. And I'm going to click like in the upper left corner of the form grid. And now in order to make space for the other frame, I'm going to move this frame over as far left as I can, where I can actually see the borders of it. And then I'm going to decrease its width manually by just clicking on the right center sizing handle, so my mouse looks like a double-headed arrow, and dragging it backwards about that much. And so we're going to give the frame a name, and it's going to be FRA is the prefix for frame control, capital P, period. And we're also going to give it a caption of period. And the caption is what shows up in the upper left-hand corner of the frame. Now we're going to copy that frame, paste it onto your grid, and drag the pasted frame to the right of your period frame. And for this one, we're going to change the name property to FRA sales, and we're going to give it a caption of sales. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add 3 option button controls into each frame. We're going to find the option button in the toolbox, and it looks like the little circle with a dot in the middle of it. It's the next to the last one in my first row. And I'm going to select the option button, and now I'm going to click inside the period frame. And then I'm going to copy that option button, and I'm going to paste it twice inside the period frame. So you'll have 3 option buttons inside your period frame. And if you click on the top one, you'll see in the name property, it's option button 1, second one is 2, second one is 3. You kind of want to have them in the right order for tab order purposes a little bit later. And again, we'll deal with the alignment a little bit later. And I'm going to show you how to get 3 option buttons in the sales frame now too. Another efficiency tip here. What we can do inside the period frame, just click in a blank area inside the period frame and do Control A. And it selects all 3 option buttons, right? And then you can just do Control C to copy them, and then right-click inside your sales frame and paste. Let's do the properties for these option buttons. So the first one inside the period frame should say option button 1 as its name property. Its name property is going to be OPT as the prefix, capital M, month, and we're going to give it a caption of month. And you can see the caption shows instead of option button 1. The second option button in the period frame, which name is currently option button 2, we're going to change it to OPT all with a caption of all. And the last option button 3 in the period frame, its name is going to be OPT other with a caption of other. So we have month, all, and other option buttons in the period frame. Let's go to the sales frame. So the first one in the sales frame, since we copied it, it's now option button 4. And we're going to give that a name of OPT salesperson with a caption of salesperson. And I'm making that caption plain English, 2 words. And then the next one in the sales frame, option button 5, that one is going to be OPT model with a caption of model. And last but not least, option button 6, its name is going to be OPT classification with a caption of classification. So now we're ready to do some formatting of our form controls, and we'll start with alignment and grouping. We're going to start by aligning the option buttons in the period frame. So just click in the period frame and do Control A like we did before to select the option buttons. And we can go up to the Format tab, the Format menu, hover over Align, and we're going to click on Lefts. So those 3 option buttons are aligned by their left edge. Let's do the same thing in the sales frame. Also align those 3 option buttons by their lefts. Now we want to align our 2 frames by their tops. So I'm going to select the period frame, hold down my Control key, and select the sales frame. That's one way of getting them both selected. I'm going to go back to Format menu, Align, and this time we're going to choose Tops. And we can click away and see they're perfectly aligned by their top edges now. Now we want to group the options buttons in each frame so that if we move any one of them, all of them will move. They'll retain their alignment and everything. So I'm going to just click in the period frame and do Control A to select all 3 option buttons. I'm going to go to the Format menu and I'm going to click on Group. And now you'll see there's one border around all 3 option buttons instead of 3 separate borders. They're grouped together now. Do the same in your sales frame. Now I'm going to show you how to use a selection net, also known as a selection marquee. It has a lot of different names to select different objects. So we want to align the period frame and the start date and end date labels by the left edges. So I'm going to click slightly above and to the left of the period frame, click and hold, and drag down until your start and end date labels are within that little guideline. So now when you let go, it selected the period frame and the start and end date labels. That's called a selection net. And we're going to go to Format, Align, Lefts. Let's use a selection net to select our display and cancel buttons as well as our combo box. And let's align those by their left edges as well. At this point, we haven't coded any of our form controls yet, but we want to test our form, make sure it displays properly, and specifically, we want to test the tab order on the form. Just make sure your form is selected, and you can use the Run button on the toolbar, Run Sub UserForm button, or you can just press F5 to run the form. And the form should pop up on your screen. It's on top of some other module. So we want to test the tab order on the form. Now, when I bring up the form, notice that it's flashing in the end date field. That's where it's starting. If I press the tab key on my keyboard, it then goes to start date. If I press tab again, it looks like it has the display button, and then the cancel button, and then the combo box. Then it goes into the period frame, and it's on month, then all, then other. Then it goes to the sales frame, and it's on salesperson, then model, then classification. The frames, the tab order is perfect because we made sure that the option button copies were in the right order. So option button 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But we can see that the rest of the tab order on this form is not the way it should be. So we're going to go ahead and fix that. Go ahead and close the X button in the upper right hand corner of your form, and it should take you back to your form design view, if you will. If not, you can double click FRM Generate Reports in your Forms folder in the Project Explorer window. So we need to adjust the tab order here. So we're going to go to the View menu, and on the View menu, you're going to select Tab Order. And I'll move this box here so we can see it a little bit better. The labels don't have to be included in the tab order because we don't want to tab to any labels in there at this point. So the tab order that we want is that it start period frame and then go to the sales frame. So they're at the bottom of my tab order list, which is why it went there last. I'm going to click and hold on FRA period and drag down to select FRA sales. And with both of them selected on the right side, I'm going to use the move up button until they're in the first and second position. Then I'm going to click on TXT start date, move that up so it's in the third position, and put TXT end date in the fourth position. We want our combo box CBO month to be underneath the end date text box. And then we want our command and display buttons underneath CBO month. And again, we're not concerned about the labels because labels are not input controls. We can click OK, and then we're going to do F5 so we can test the tab order on our form. Notice that the month in the period frame is already selected. When we do tab, it's going to go to all and then other. Then into the sales frame, salesperson, model, and classification. After that, it jumps down to the start date text box, then to the end date text box, then to the combo box, finally the display button and the cancel button. We can close the form again by using the X in the upper right hand corner. When we code the controls on our forms, we're going to be doing them in what are known as built-in class modules. These modules contain procedures that are used to respond to events for a form or maybe a worksheet, or that performs tasks in support of the form or worksheet. So we're going to be populating our combo box for starter by using code. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click on the form anywhere in the blank area of the grid. And this is only one way of doing this. And we're going to choose View Code. So now if you look up at the top, right, it gives you the file that we're in, but it says FRM Generate Reports Code. that is a built-in class module. This is the code just for that particular form. The first thing we're going to do is explore the object list where it says it defaults to UserForm, right? And notice the UserForm default procedure is the click event. Well, do the drop down next to the right of UserForm, and you'll see all of the controls that we've placed on that form. And this is a good example of when using the prefix is handy. Your command buttons are grouped together. Your frames are grouped together. Your option buttons are grouped together, as are your text boxes. So you don't have to keep looking through a list for something, not knowing what the actual control is. So that's a good example of why you want to use those prefixes here. We're going to leave it on the UserForm object. Now I mentioned that it defaults to the click procedure, but we want our code to be based on its initialize procedure. So to the right of click in your procedure list, you're going to select initialize. And just like when we did an event procedure earlier, we don't need to keep the framework for private sub user form click. We're going to just delete that and leave our private sub user form initialize in sub statement. The initialize procedure happens when the form is loaded into memory. So when the form is run, that's when this procedure will happen. At the end of the private subline, we're going to press enter twice, and we're going to do a with end with statement. So I'm going to tab over, and I'm going to type with, and then CBO month. So that's the combo box, the month combo box. I'm going to press enter, tab. I'm going to do dot, and the list pops up. We want to use the add item method. So dot add item, space, and in double quotes, Jan for January. Now you can copy that add item line. We need 12 of them, January through December, and we're just using the 3-character abbreviation for the months with no period. And once you have your 12 add item lines, we're going to shift tab, and we have to have our end with statement. And you can go ahead and compile and save. And in your project Explorer window, you're going to double click FRM generate reports. We're going to press F5 to run it. And we just want to test our drop down. So go to your for which month drop down, and you should see January through December there. We added those items to the combo box. And we can close generate sales reports form. And we're going to change one property for that combo box. So select the combo box on your form grid, and we're going to go down to its text property, and that's like the default property. So we want it to default to January. So we're going to just type JAN there and enter. And now if we, so I have to select my form first, and F5, we'll see that the for which month combo box is now defaulting to January, and we can close it. Another way to access the code window for the form is just by double clicking on the form grid, and that will take you to your built-in class module. And it's built in because a form is a built-in object here in Excel VBA. So unlike a regular class module where you're actually creating objects that are not included in the application, this is a built-in class. And so we're in the code window, and we're going to hide controls based on when another control is selected. So for example, if month is selected in the period frame, we want to hide the start date and end date labels and text boxes. And we have several event procedures to code. So we're going to insert a text file and then review the code for your understanding. First, we're going to declare some variables, and we're going to click at the top after option explicit and press enter. And we're going to do public sales, comma, period as string, and press enter. So we're declaring variables up in the declaration section, and we're making them public, so that means they're available to any modules here. And then we're going to click underneath our end with statement. We'll click at the end of it and press enter. And we're going to type CBO month, that's our combo box name, dot visible, which is a property, equals false, which shows up on your list. Right underneath that, we're going to type LBL month dot visible, that's its label, equals false. So right now it's telling it not to show the combo box or the label, but we're not done yet. So we're going to click at the end of end sub and press enter, and then we're going to go to our insert menu and choose file. And we want to grab that coding controls text file, so we can just double click it. And boy, did it help us with a lot of typing. Look at all the stuff that's in here. We'll go over what all of this code that we didn't have to type means. We declared two string variables, sales and period. The first thing that came in from the text file is private sub CMD cancel click. So when the cancel button on the form is clicked, it's going to unload the form from memory. And me is just a shortcut for the current object, in this case the form. So that's one thing that came in from the text file, coding that cancel button. And then we have our opt all button. When that option button is selected, when it's clicked or accessed, it's going to set the period variable to all. When the classification option button is clicked, it's going to set the sales variable to equal classification. When the model option button is clicked, it's going to assign model to the sales variable. So we need to do a fix here, because I just noticed that model doesn't have double quotes on it coming from the text file, and it needs to, or we would get an error message. And you might want to make a note, if you want to avoid that later, to just go into the text file and change it in there. So the next sub procedure is opt month when it changes. If that opt month button is clicked, right, and you see this next sub procedure, it's going to set the period to equal month. If opt month equals true, then we want the combo box and the label to be visible, or else we want them to be hidden. Unless they need to select a month, they don't need to have the label or the combo box showing up on the form. And then we'll go to our private sub opt other. This one has a change event, and this one has a click event. So when it's clicked, the other option button, it will set the period to other. And if it's other, then we want the start date and end date text boxes to be enabled, so they're accessible if they select other in that frame. Or else we want them to be disabled, so they'll still be visible, but the end user won't be able to access them. And then the last but not least, if they select the salesperson option button in the sales frame, it's going to set sales variable to equal salesperson. And you want to go ahead and compile and save. Let's go test some of this. So I'm going to just double click my form in the Forms folder in Project Explorer to get back over to it. And the first thing we're going to do is in the Properties pane, we're going to disable the start date and end date text boxes. So I'm going to click in the start date text box, and I'm going to double click the enabled property to change it from true to false. And I'm going to do the same with the end date text box. And now I'm going to go ahead and press F5 to run the form. So make sure you're just on the grid and you don't have any controls selected. And then F5 will be successful for you. And so the first thing I want you to do is try to click in the start date and end date text boxes, and you cannot. In the period frame, select the month option, and you'll notice that the combo box and its label will now become visible and accessible on the form. If you select the All option button in the period frame, your start date and end date text boxes are not available to you because we want it to run all the reports for all of the dates. And then if you select the Other option button, now you have the ability to get into the start date and end date text boxes. So in the background on my screen, you see that Opt Other change is what's causing that. So if they select Opt Other, if they select the Other option button, it's going to assign the period valuable the value of Other, and it's going to enable the start date and end date text boxes. And now we're going to use the X in the upper right hand corner to close the form again. And the last thing we're going to do, instead of us having to go to the Forms folder and double click the form and then F5 to run it, we want to launch it programmatically. So we're going to do that now. We're going to go over to our Project Explorer window. We can right click on the Modules folder, hover over Insert, and choose Module. And we're going to rename Module 2 in its Properties window. We're going to name it MOD Reports. And in Mod Reports, we're going to type a very short sub-procedure. So we're going to type sub, we're going to name it Show Form, press Enter twice. And we're going to tab over, we're going to type the name of our form, including its prefix, FRM, Generate Reports, the dot notation, and then we want the show method. We just created a sub-procedure that will show the form when this procedure runs. And now we can compile and save, and we could just execute the procedure by pressing F5 anywhere within it. It brings up the form. And because we brought it in from a text file, we coded the cancel button. We can actually use the cancel button to unload the form from memory and close it. In this lesson, we learned about and used the UserForm object. We changed some form properties, and we went over some properties, events, and methods for form controls. We accessed the toolbox to be able to get to our form controls, and we added controls to the form and modified their properties. And then we did some formatting of form controls in terms of alignment and grouping, and we moved on to creating code for form controls in a built-in class module. And we used a lot of code from a text file that was in the files in the video description. We ultimately ended up launching the form via code, and we will be revisiting using the form in a later lesson. In Lesson 7, we will be working with the pivot table object in Visual Basic. So the first thing we're going to do is create a pivot table in Excel, and then we're going to create a pivot table in Visual Basic for applications. When end users use the form that we created in the previous lesson, it is going to generate pivot table reports based on the user's choices on the form. After we get our pivot tables done, we're going to finalize our form, and then you'll learn how to add code to a button in Excel for ease of use. Pivot tables allow you to summarize data from a worksheet or an external data source and create reports. You can decide how to summarize the data and the data to be analyzed. And after you create a pivot table, you can pivot the data to look at it in different ways for different analysis. When you're creating a pivot table in VBA, two separate objects are used. The pivot table object, which is the pivot table in the workbook, and the pivot cache object, which is a memory location that's created, and it holds the source data the pivot table is created from. When you're doing this in Visual Basic, the pivot cache object needs to exist before a pivot table is created. So you use what's known as the create method of the pivot cache's collection object to create that pivot cache in VBA. And I have on this slide its syntax. The one required argument is source type, and then you have two optional arguments, source data and version. The source type argument has 5 options in the form of Excel constants. So we saw Visual Basic constants earlier. They're preceded by VB, like when we were working with the message box, right? These are Excel constants which are preceded by XL. So you have consolidation, database, external, pivot table, and scenario. Process-wise, once the pivot cache is created, the CreatePivot method of the pivot cache object will be accessed to create the pivot table. And it has 4 arguments as listed on this slide: table destination, table name, read data, and default version. And the final 3, the only one that's required is the table destination argument. And again, this is background information for your future review if you need to refresh on anything. I will be guiding you through this when we get started. The pivot cache and pivot table can be created in the same procedure, and the fields that are going to populate the pivot table have to be set up separately within what's known as the pivot fields collection. Yes, this sounds complicated until you get used to it. When it comes to pivot fields collection, it's a member of the pivot table object, and it contains the columns of data from the data source. The pivot fields orientation property is used to populate the pivot table report. Field names are assigned to the values in each column based on the column headings. And Excel constants are used here as well. If you're used to pivot tables, you have row labels, column labels, you have report filter, you have values. So the Excel row field would be for your row labels, Excel column field for your column labels, Excel page field is used for the report filter, and Excel data field is used for the values. You have an extra constant here, Excel hidden, which is used to hide a field. And then at the bottom, I have the syntax of the orientation property for your future reference. So we're going to start in our sales fiscal year file by recording 2 macros to create the pivot table. So I'm on the 26th of August sheet tab, and I'm going to just click anywhere within my data there. And we're going to start a macro recording. So I'm going to use the No Macros Currently Recording button down in my status bar that we used earlier. I'm going to click on that, and we're going to name this macro Create Pivot Table. And then we're going to just click OK. Now just make sure you're anywhere within your data, and except for on that sum of the selling price, we're going to be anywhere within the data. Go to the Insert tab of the ribbon, and the first button is Pivot Table. I'm going to click the upper half of the button. In the Create Pivot Table dialog box, you'll see that it has selected all of your data. We were just anywhere within our range, and it will select everything until it finds a blank. And that's the choice we wanted to use, select a table or range. And then the next choice you make is choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed. It defaults to a new worksheet, which is typically how they're used. And so we can just click OK. So we're on a new sheet. We have the framework of our pivot table on the worksheet. And to the right, we have our pivot table fields list. This is where we need to stop this recording. Remember, it's a 2-step process even when you're recording it as a macro in Excel. The first step is to create the framework of the pivot table, and we've done that. So I'm going to go down to my status bar and select Stop Recording. Now we need to record a macro that will select the fields that we want in our pivot table report. So I'm going to go back to my status bar and start another macro recording. And this one I'm going to name Select Fields and click OK. In your field list on the right, you're going to drag your year field to the filters box underneath. And notice your pivot table report is already starting to shape up. We're going to drag classification to columns. And we see our pivot table. We have our column labels, and it's showing the classifications: car, SUV, truck, minivan. We're going to drag, well, we could put a checkbox in front of make, and it will automatically put it in the rows box. And we're going to put if we scroll down, we're going to put a check mark in front of selling price, and it's automatically going to put that in the values box. So any text-based field will automatically go into rows, and any numeric field will automatically go into values, and the default aggregate that's used is the sum function. So now in our pivot table, we can see our row labels are the makes of the vehicles, our column labels are the classification, and we're getting the selling price for each combination there. Now we're ready to stop our macro, our second macro, from recording. So you could stop the recording. And let's switch over to Visual Basic Editor. And in Project Explorer, I'm going to collapse that Microsoft Excel Objects folder. And now you'll notice we have Mod Reports, Module 1, and Module 2. We're going to double-click Module 2, and that's where it put the code for the two macros we recorded. And we're going to rename Module 2, so using its properties, we're going to name it Mod Sheet Pivot. So this is the code that was created when we did our create pivot table macro, right? It's adding, you can see it's referencing the pivot caches object, right? And we're using the source type of Excel database. And you have all of this code that was generated by your two separate macro recordings. And then we had to record a separate macro for selecting the fields. And that's where you'll see those Excel constants for page field, column field, row field, so on and so forth. So if you create a pivot table while recording a macro in Excel, you have to record two macros. One to set up the framework of the pivot table, and the second one to populate the pivot table report with the appropriate fields. Now we're going to start creating our pivot table in Visual Basic Editor. And so we're going to start by creating the pivot cache and pivot table objects, which can be in the same procedure, as you'll see. But before we do that, switch back over to Excel and delete the sheet that has your pivot table report on it. And then we're going to insert a new sheet, a new worksheet, and we're going to name it Reports. And the sheet tabs in your Excel file should look like mine on the screen. So I made the report sheet the first one, and I deleted the other sheet where we recorded our macro and created the pivot table. And now we can switch back over to the Visual Basic Editor. In your Project Explorer window, switch to Mod Reports, where we have just that one small sub procedure that shows the form. We're going to click after the in sub statement here, and you're going to type the sub procedure that I will display on my screen momentarily. I've changed my font size to 18, so you can create that sub procedure that we're naming CreatePivot based on what's on my screen. We'll talk about it after you get it typed in. In this sub procedure, we are declaring two object variables, destination and range data, both with the range object type. We're setting the destination variable to equal that reports worksheet, cell A1 that we just created in Excel. And we're setting the range data object variable to equal the range A1 through J1 all the way down to the last populated cell in column J. After that, we're accessing the pivot caches object. So activeworkbook.pivotcaches.create. And I'm using the line continuation character there, space and underscore. And this time in the parentheses, we're using a different syntax. And we're doing this here because you'll probably come across it in code that you inherit. So we're actually naming the arguments and separating them from their values by using a colon and an equal sign. So the first argument for the pivot caches is the source type. And for an Excel spreadsheet, the data on an Excel spreadsheet, you use the Excel constant of Excel database. The next argument is the source data, and that is going to be the range data. So A1 through the last populated cell in column J. And then we're doing another line continuation character at the end of that line. And now we're moving on to the CreatePivot method of the pivot cache object. And that line starts with .CreatePivot, and then we're giving it a destination for the table, which is what we populated as the destination object variable. So the report sheet cell A1 is where we're going to start the pivot table framework. And then we're naming the pivot table sales pivot. Let's go ahead and compile and save our work. And we'll switch to Excel. We need to run that sub procedure, our create pivot procedure, on a sheet that's populated with data. So I'm going to go to my 26th of August sheet tab, and I'm going to just be anywhere within my data. And I'm going to do Alt F8 to bring up the macros dialog box. And we want to double click Create Pivot. It doesn't initially look like anything happened, but we told it to put the framework of the pivot table on the Reports Sheet tab. So let's go to Reports, and we'll see the framework of our pivot table. So now that we have the framework of our pivot table, we're going to switch back over to the Visual Basic Editor because we have to create our fields collection. Regardless of whether you're creating a pivot table by recording a macro or by using Visual Basic for applications, it's going to be a two-step process. We're going to be still working in Mod Reports, and we're going to go up to the top and click After Option Explicit. We need to declare some variable names up here. So we're going to type public, and after we click After Option Explicit, I pressed Enter. We're going to use the public keyword, page name, comma, row name, comma, column name, comma, data name as string. So 4 string variables we declared in the declaration section, and you can press Enter. So now we're going to go to the bottom of our Create Pivot sub procedure, click at the end of the end sub statement and press Enter. And we're going to create another procedure, sub procedure here. So we're going to type sub, and the name of it is Set Fields, and press Enter a couple of times. Well, we're going to declare an object variable here within the procedure. So we're going to do dim. And then I'm just calling it PVT table as pivot table. And pivot table will show up on your list. Underneath that, we're going to use the set statement. Remember, we have to use set for our object variables. Set PVT table, and then equal worksheets, and in parentheses and double quotes, reports, dot pivot tables, and in parentheses we need to put what we named the pivot table, which is in quotes, it's sales pivot. And then we're going to close those parentheses. We're going to press Enter twice, and we're going to do a with end with block. So we're going to indent, and we're going to type with PVT table, enter, and tab. We're going to do dot pivot fields, which will show up on your list. And then in parentheses, page name dot orientation equals XL page field. So we're referencing that constant. And just a reminder, the XL page field constant refers to the field that's going to go into the report filter box. We're going to press enter, and we're going to do dot pivot fields again. This time in the parentheses, we're going to type row name dot orientation, and this one is going to equal XL row field. So the field that's going to go into the rows box for the pivot table. Enter again. We have 2 more of these lines that we have to do. So dot pivot fields, and use the list as necessary to decrease your typing. And in parentheses for this one, we're going to do column name dot orientation, and this one equals XL column field. And last but not least, we're going to do dot pivot fields, in parentheses data name, and that's for the values, dot orientation equal XL data field. We're going to press enter and shift tab, and we're going to type in our end with statement and enter again. So now what we're going to do is we're going to finish up this sub procedure. We have 4 more lines to type, and I'm going to shift tab to outdent, so I'm at the same margin as our dim and set lines. And we're going to type active workbook dot sheets, and then in parentheses and double quotes, reports dot activate. And I'll scroll down so you can see this a little bit better. Our next line is PVT table, like our object variable name, dot pivot select. Then we're going to type a space and a set of double quotes, comma, and from the list that pops up, we're going to select XL data only, another Excel constant. So the data field is the values field, and we're typing this line to say select all of the values, and we're going to press enter, and then we're going to tell it how to format it. So selection dot number format equals, and in double quotes, we're going to type a $, £, comma, 2 more £, and a 0, and then close your double quotes. The number format, and I have it highlighted on my screen that we're using, so it's going to start it with a $, and the pound represents any digit that may be in that position. You have your thousand separator is the comma, and then we have 2 more £, so digit placeholders. If they're in that position, it will put them there. If not, it will skip it. And we're saying that we're not going to have any decimal places on our numbers here. If we wanted decimal places, after the ending 0, we could do a dot and then 0, 0, which means that it would have 2 decimal places. The 0 that's sitting there instead of the £, or as they're now known, hashtags, that would represent a leading 0 for a number if it's less than 1. So that's the number format, and you'll see it once we finish this up. And now we have 1 more line to finish this set field sub procedure, and we're going to just type range and in parentheses and double quotes E1 dot select. This is going to set the fields, whether they are filter fields, row fields, column fields, or your values fields for the pivot table that we created. Because the variables will not populate until we actually run the form again. We're going to be able to test this, our sub-procedure for setting the fields, in just a little while. We have some more tasks that we're going to complete that I have under the heading Finalizing the Form. What we're going to do here is we're going to create code that will generate pivot table reports based on the selections the user chooses in the form. So in other words, we're going to distribute user responses to the correct procedures. Specifically, we're going to create code that will perform these steps when the user activates the display button on the form. We want it to hide the form, and whatever option is selected in the period frame will be evaluated, determining the month or the start date and end date of the pivot table report. The sales option that is selected in the sales frame will also be evaluated, and at this point the variables containing the field names will be populated. Then the source data will be pulled from the workbook and placed on a new sheet, and then the data will be moved to a new workbook and the pivot table will be created. So we're going to get started on these finalizing the form steps, and I'm still in Visual Basic Editor. And in the Project Explorer window, I'm going to expand Forms folder and double click our Generate Reports form to get back to it. And then I'm going to double click in a blank area of our form to get back to our built-in class module, which has all the code that we've created for this so far. So we want to select the framework for the click event for your display command button. So where it says UserForm at the very top of the module, in the procedure list, we're going to do the drop down and we're going to select CMD display. So now we have private subs CMD display click event waiting for us, because click is the default procedure for a command button. I'm going to click after the opening and closing parentheses and press enter a couple of times. And we're going to tab and we're going to type me.hide. And hide is on the list. And in this instance, as we saw previously when we used me, it's referring to the form. When we click the display button, it's going to hide the form. That's one thing that we need to happen. So now we're going to declare some variables up top in the declaration section, and we already have public sales and period as string. Click after period, type a comma, and type month. So we have sales period and month as string variables. Press enter at the end of the as string line, and we're going to type public start date, comma, end date as date, and press enter. Now we're going to navigate to the end of this module, and we're going to create another sub-procedure there that's going to code the options selected in the period frame on the form. And we're going to use a select case construct here. So at the very bottom of the module, we're going to type sub. We're going to name it get dates. Press enter a couple of times and then tab. And I'll scroll down so you can see my whole construct down there. And we're going to type select case period, enter, and then tab, case, and then in double quotes, month, enter, tab, month equals CBO month. And we'll type all of this in and then I'll go over it and review it with you. After I press enter after CBO month, I'm going to shift tab so I get back to the case margin, and I'm going to type case and in double quotes all, enter, tab, start date equals get first date, enter, end date equals get last date, enter, shift tab, case, and then double quotes, other. So we have month, all, and other in our period frame. Enter. And we're going to do start date equals txt start date. Enter. End date equals txt end date. Enter. Shift tab twice, and you're going to type end select. And then I'm going to press enter again, so I get that blank line between end select and end sub. So let me break this down for you. We're doing a select case statement, which is like an if, then, else if, end if statement. So we have three cases here, right, based on the period. So case month means the month equals whatever month is selected in the combo box. When they select all in that period frame, the start date is going to equal the results of a function procedure that we don't have in here yet called GetFirstDate. And then the end date is going to equal the result of a function procedure that we also don't have in here yet called GetLastDate. And then if they select other in the period frame, the start date is going to be the start date that the end user puts in the start date text box, and the end date will be the end date that the end user puts in the end date text box. So that's what we've created here in this get date sub procedure. Now the good news is the two procedures that we don't have in here yet, GetFirstDate and GetLastDate, we're going to bring in from a text file so we don't have to type it, and then we'll review it. So I'm going to click at the end of the end sub statement and press enter beneath our get date sub procedure. And we're going to go to insert menu, file. And this particular file that we want is going to be, well, we have GetFirstDate. We'll bring in the GetLastDate first. So we're going to do GetLastDate, double click that file, and then go to the end of that function. After the end function statement, be on the next blank line, go back to insert file, and we're going to insert GetFirstDate. And so now let's review these GetLastDate and GetFirstDate functions. We'll start with GetLastDate. So we're doing object variables here, dim sheet as worksheet. And then we're just doing regular variables, last date and test date. We're declaring those as dates. So we're starting with last date equals 0. And we're using a for each next construct. So this is going to go through the worksheets. For each sheet in worksheets, the test date equals, and it says C date, and then in parentheses, sheet.name. So the name of the worksheets in this file are dates. And C date is a conversion function that it's going to convert the text date on the sheet tab into an actual date. So let's say it's on the 26th of August, 2016 sheet, right? It's going to convert the text on the sheet tab to a date format and assign it to the test date variable. And then it says, if test date is greater than the last date, then the last date equals the test date. And that's in an if then end if construct, which is nested in our for each next structure. Then it's going to go to the next sheet, and it's going to repeat the process until there's no more sheets, and then it will determine what the last date is. And so the result of the function GetLastDate will be the last date that's in the file. And then GetFirstDate is similar, right, where we have our declarations, and then it starts first date equals 99.99, or actually 5 nines. And for each sheet, it's going to convert the sheet name date to a date. And if the test date is less than the first date, then the first date equals the test date. And then it ends that if block with end if, goes to the next sheet, repeats the process until there are no more sheets. Now notice this one came in and the last line is red. And if it's not, when you go to compile, it's going to be red because we declared first date and it's all mushed together. But in the text file, it came in as two separate words. So I'm going to just mush it together in that line. And now we can compile and save. So those two function procedures will determine the earliest date and the latest date in the workbook for the period frame. At this point, we have 3 more procedures that we're going to need to do. We're only going to type one of them. We'll bring in the other 2. Well, actually, we have 4 procedures. We're going to type one of them and bring in the remaining 3 from text files. So we're at the bottom of this module, and we're going to create a sub procedure under our GetFirstDate function procedure. And I'm going to just type sub, and I'm going to type get sales by grouping and press enter twice. So this procedure is going to code the options in the sales frame on the form. So it's kind of like telling it if they select salesperson in the sales frame, what fields need to be in that pivot table report, and so on and so forth. So we're going to do a select case statement for this. I'm going to tab over, type select case sales, press enter, and then tab, case, and in double quotes, it's going to be salesperson, and on the form, made that 2 words. And then we're going to press enter and tab. So no, page name, which is the filter for the pivot table, equals, and in double quotes, sales person. And I'm going to check whether that needs to be separated there. Sometimes it's what you called it on the form, and then other times it's the way it shows as a column header. So I will definitely double check that before we test these procedures. And then we're going to do enter. And we're going to do row name equals, in quotes, year, enter, column name equals make, and then our data name for our values in the pivot table report is going to equal selling price. And I believe these are the headings on the spreadsheet. We have a few more finishing touches we need to do in order to complete this process. So we want to navigate to Mod Reports and go to the bottom of the module under our Set Fields sub-procedure. And we're going to use a text file to bring in 3 other procedures. So we're going to go up to Insert File. And this time we want to consolidate data text file. I did this as a text file because it actually contains 3 different procedures. So we have a sub procedure named consolidate data. Then we have another sub procedure telling it where to start grabbing the cells. And we have another sub procedure for finishing the report. And just to kind of go over them briefly for you, what these are doing. So the consolidate data sub-procedure will create a temporary worksheet in the file and name it reports. And that will hold your pivot table report. Based on the option the user selects in the period frame, it will collect the data from the worksheets. This procedure calls a function that directs it to select the pertinent cells from each worksheet. And if you look through it, you can see the code blocks for that. And they have select case statements, and they're using grab cells to grab some cells. When it references grab cells, it's calling the sub procedure right underneath it named grab cells. It's passed an argument that is the beginning row number of the cells to be selected. And it uses an if construct to grab all the cells on each worksheet that are applicable to the choices made in the form. And then last but certainly not least, we have a sub-procedure named FinishReport, and that moves the collected data from the reports worksheet into an existing workbook in the same directory named Reports. It then deletes the report worksheet in the sales fiscal year file and creates the pivot table in the reports workbook. I should mention this by now. We have created across different files multiple modules. We also have a built-in class module for our form. So you have lots of different blocks of code. And what you want to do is, as you're working in Visual Basic, you want to start saving your code blocks that actually work, so after they're tested. And I have a code repository. I just copy and paste my sub and function procedures into a Word document, because a lot of times you can reuse the same code over and over again. You might have to just change a file name or something like that. But why build it from the ground when you already know you have code that has worked before? So I'll make that suggestion here because, and especially some of these text files, you're getting really great code blocks to use in future VBA projects. We have just a few more finishing touches before we'll test everything. And this time, we want to go to our built-in class module for our form. So I'm going to just double-click FRM Generate Reports in the Forms folder, and then I'm going to double-click a blank area of the form to get into that module. We want to locate the click event for the display command button. Toward the top of mine, I have private sub cmd display _ click. And currently, it only has me hide in that sub procedure. Click at the end of me hide and press enter. And now we're going to use this to call other procedures. We are going to call our get dates procedure, enter. Get sales by grouping procedure, enter. Consolidate data, and we're going to pass it an argument of month, so we can just put month after it, consolidate data month, and the finish report procedure, and then we're going to type unload me. So when the display button is clicked on the form, it's going to hide the form, and it's going to call those procedures: get dates, get sales by grouping, consolidate data, finish report, and then it's going to unload the form from memory. Now we have a modification we need to make in mod reports. So we're going to go back to mod reports, and I'm going to use the procedure list to navigate to the set fields procedure. We need to make a small modification there. So when we created this set field sub procedure, we did a number format. But then when we created the get sales by grouping sub procedure for the selection in the sales frame, if they select model, we made color the data name. So we made color the value field. We don't want the colors to be displayed with like a currency format, really, because it's just going to be a count of color here. We need to change this set fields procedure so it doesn't put a numeric currency format on a color field if that's what's selected in the sales frame. To adjust that, if it is an actual value, like a selling price value, we do want it formatted in a currency format. But if it's a count of models, we don't. So we're going to address that by using an if function. So click at the end of the line that says active workbook.sheets reports.activate and press enter. And you're going to go ahead and tab. And we're going to type if, And then the name of our form, FRM, generate reports dot sales, and we're going to use our not equal to, so less than, greater than, and then in double quotes we're going to type model. If what they select in the sales frame on our form is not equal to model, we want it to go ahead and give it the currency format. So we're going to type then after model. And then we're going to come down to the line that has selection.number format. Click at the end of that line and press enter. And you're going to tab and you're going to type end if. So it's only going to apply a currency format if the selection in the sales frame is not model. Otherwise, it won't apply. If it is model, it won't apply the currency format. It'll just be the number. And we're going to make a minor modification to our CreatePivot procedure. So I'm going to use my procedure list to navigate to that one. And then here in the set range data line, we're going to change the J1 range to I1. So when it consolidates all the data, it's only filling the column I. We don't need it to say J there. So just another minor change. And now we're going to go ahead and compile and save. So two things we're going to do before we test this. I promised that I would double check our sub procedure, get sales by grouping. It's part of your built-in class module for your form to determine whether the salesperson case should be one word or two words. It actually should be one word there, so I'm going to adjust that and I'm going to compile and save. And then I'm going to have you switch over to Excel and delete the sheet tab that you created that you named reports, which has the framework of the pivot table on it. So just delete that sheet tab because it's going to happen for us automatically when we test this. And once you do that, come back over to Visual Basic Editor and we're going to double click our form in the forms folder. And then we're going to press F5 to run this form. We are going to select month in the period frame. And then go down to the bottom right to your combo box and select July. And in the sales frame, we're going to select salesperson. And then you're going to go ahead and click your display button. It's going to click and whir for a little bit on your screen. And finally, when it's done, now I'm getting a not responding message, but that'll clear. We'll see that a message box will pop up that says Microsoft Excel will permanently delete this sheet. Do you want to continue? Now notice it created that reports sheet tab for us and it just gathered all the information for the pivot table report. So we're going to tell it to delete this sheet. And when I switch back over to Excel, you'll notice that you're in a whole different file. This reports file has been sitting in the same directory as our sales fiscal year file. And it was a file that was in the video description. And what it did is, first thing we're going to look at is the Consolidate Sheet tab. So all the stuff that it gathered together for the selections in the form, it put on the Consolidate Sheet tab, and then it created the Reports Sheet tab where your actual pivot table report is showing. So if we click on that pivot table report and you look at your fields list, the salesperson is being used as the filter field. We have make in columns, year in rows, and the sum of the selling price in values. And we're going to close this reports file without saving the changes. And you should still be in sales fiscal year, and it doesn't have a report sheet tab. So we're going to test this again using different selections on the form. Let's do Alt F11 to get back to our form. and then we're going to make sure it's selected and press F5 to run it. And this time we'll still select month and select July. But this time in the sales frame, we're going to select model. And now we're going to choose display. So again, the clicking and whirring where it's running all those procedures and gathering the data. And you will ultimately get the message asking if you want to permanently delete this report sheet in sales fiscal year. And we're going to say delete. And then when you switch back over to Excel, it is in that reports file. And again, if you look at the consolidate sheet, it has all the data that was consolidated. And then we go to the report sheet. And this is where we put in that if statement, because when we select model, we said we don't want the count of the models to be formatted as currency. And you can see here, or the count, of the model colors, we don't want them to be formatted as currency. So they're not. They're just the count of the colors per model. And we can close the reports file without saving the changes. So now we're going to set up a way for the end user to display the form and make their choices without having to go into the code window. So we're going to add a button to the quick access toolbar that will show the form for the end user. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go up to the quick access toolbar, and currently mine just has save on it. And to the right of the save icon, there's a drop down arrow. And when you select the drop-down arrow, you have a list of commands, but toward the bottom, you're going to select more commands. And it opens up the Customize the Quick Access Toolbar Excel Options window. Now on the right, it defaults to Customize Quick Access Toolbar for all documents. That's the default. Well, we want this button to only show in this document. So we're going to do the drop-down next to For All Documents. And we're going to choose for sales fiscal year. And then what we're going to do on the left side, we're going to access the drop down where it says choose commands from popular commands. And when we do that drop down, we see popular commands, commands not in the ribbon, all commands, and macros. We're going to click on macros. Scroll down in this list until you see the show form macro. We're going to select it. And then we're going to click the add button. So on the right, you should just have show form sitting there for this particular document. On the bottom right, so you notice all of these macros have that same symbol, right? We're going to change the symbol. So with show form selected on the right, underneath on the right, you're going to click on the modify button. Pick a symbol of your choice from the list of symbols that are showing there that you would like to have on the quick access toolbar for this. So I always like to do different ones than the default ones. I think for this one, I'm going to just pick, I'll just pick the red circle. No, I'll do the colorful butterfly just for fun. So I'm going to click on the butterfly and click OK. And now you'll see the icon in front of show form. And at the bottom, you're going to click OK. So now you have that icon, whichever one you selected, on your quick access toolbar. And when I click that icon, it actually brings up the form. So this is how the end users will be able to access the form. And we can do cancel on our form. And you're going to go ahead and save your file. To recap Lesson 7, we started by recording 2 separate macros in Excel to create a pivot table first, the framework of the pivot table, and then to create the fields that we want to use to populate the pivot table. So 2 separate macro recordings. Then we went into Visual Basic for applications, and we created a pivot table programmatically, we had to create the pivot cache object first, and then we could tell it to create the pivot table. And we can do that in the same procedure, but we had to do a separate procedure to set the fields for the pivot table, just like we had to create two separate macro recordings, one for the framework of the pivot table and one to set the fields. After that, we spent some time finalizing our form by adding more code, and we used some text files for some of the code that we added. We then reviewed some of those text files and their procedures therein. So you learned about the consolidate data procedure, grab cells function, and the finish report procedure, and what they do in terms of the workflow here. And then we modified our click event procedure for the display command button by calling all of the other procedures that we created or we created via text file. And we added a line that said unload the form from memory once all of the other procedures have run. We saw when we tested everything, and we tested it a couple of times, that it gathers all the data and puts it on a reports sheet tab in the sales fiscal year file, and then it copies and pastes that data into a reports file in the same directory on its consolidate tab. And then it creates the pivot table on another tab in the reports file, and the pivot table displays the choices that were made on the form. And we ended up adding code to a button on the quick access toolbar in Excel, and I selected the butterfly icon, and that's the way the user will launch the form to make their selections to get their pivot table reports created. Thank you for attending Excel 2019 Visual Basic for Applications video course.